I already introduced you a little bit, but I'd love to just summarize it a bit. Of course, we have invited you here because of your large experience as an historian of the city, of urban design, but also because you are an urban designer yourself and city planner, and you've made a number of important projects in this field. So it's obvious that you have worked a lot about the questions of how resilient is urban design to different conditions that a city can face in different moments of its history. And of course, the Corona condition is such a situation, and it also reminds us of historical precedents that the cities all over the world went through in centuries, when cholera epidemics and other healthcare crises struck cities hard, killed thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. And I wanted to ask you as first questions, what do you think we can learn from the history of urban catastrophes in the healthcare area to better understand the current condition that we're in today?
I think we can learn a lot of things from the history of urban design, of course, since it's my subject and what I'm really interested in. I think we can learn two things. One is that urban design should try to be a little bit more self-assured about itself. It seems to me that it is very, especially in the 20th century and now also in the 21st century, it is very, let's say, reactive to inputs from the outside. I will make a small detour, but we will get back to the subject. But imagine what happened when the car came in. Then all of a sudden, all urban designers of the world, it was in the 50s especially, or then also in the 60s, tried to accommodate the car to the city without thinking, is it a good thing? Without thinking, what does it do to the city? It was just a necessity, and it had to be accommodated somehow. And of course, we all know what this has done to the city. So I think one thing we can learn from history is that urban design is, or maybe has become, a very insecure discipline, a discipline that does not believe in itself really, and does not believe in its own tradition and its own certainties and its own let's say intrinsic disciplinary ideas, but clings to everything that is in a way brought to her. I'm coming back now to your question finally. So what is happening now? I think what is happening now is that, at least what I see in the publications and in the reactions, is that architects and urban designers immediately think, how should we change our cities in order to cope with the COVID-19 problem? But this doesn't make any sense, because a city is not a hospital. A city is not has not been invented to keep people healthy, but is a much more complicated dispositive, a much more complicated mechanism that has to deal with many other functions. And so I think we should reflect on these functions before we also think of what we can do to make our cities healthier, threatened as they are by pandemic catastrophes.
But how did historically urban designers and planners react to epidemics that really killed a lot of people that were obviously related to hygienic problems? There was some kind of reaction necessary, wasn't there?
Yes, yes. Well, at first, I must say, if you think of the big plagues in Rome, in antique Rome, but then also in the in the medieval cities, not much was done in urbanistic terms. They tried to keep the cities a little bit cleaner, which was absolutely necessary because they were really dirty. They tried to keep people cleaner too and healthier too, but nothing was really changed in the, let's say, in the urban planning of the city because of these plagues. It changed, I would say, in the 19th century when there were the big cholera epidemics, and then people really started to reflect on how they could improve the city and how they could cope with these epidemics. But think of Cerdà in Barcelona or Haussmann in Paris. What did they do? They did straight streets, larger streets, because they thought this would, bring more clean air into the city. They did, I think this was very important. They did a decent canalization. They brought away the dirt. They made a lot of regulations in terms of the butchers that were not allowed anymore to butcher on the street, which was, something that they used to do, but not very nice and clean. So these were the main changes. But I would say there were changes that were meant to improve the city, but not simply on hygienic terms. This was one dimension, but it was also the traffic, it was also the military, it was also political repression. So it was, not for Saddam, of course, for Osman. So it was part of an overall strategy where it fitted nicely. If there is. After we had our first conversation, Andreas, that was, let's say, the kind of preparation. I looked up a little bit. I prepared myself. I'm not unprepared. I prepared myself. So I looked up. I looked for a city that was conceived for hygienical reasons. Simply, I found. Maybe somebody else finds many other more. I found only one. It's called Hygeia. It is so after the goddess of health, which makes sense. It was conceived by an English doctor, a certain Richardson, in the middle of the 19th century. Richardson was a very good doctor. He was a friend of John Snow, the same John Snow to whom we owe the discovery of why cholera really came up in London. I want to go too deep into this, but what I want to say, this idea, this Richardson, who was not an urban planner, he was a doctor, he described this city. It's an ideal city. It's a big city for 100,000 people, and it's interesting. It has never been drawn up. It's just described in a very nice and long text. But if you look at what he really wanted to do, I mean, the innovations of this city in terms of, let's say, the traditional city, these innovations that were meant to improve the health situation, where basically canalization makes a lot of sense. Gardens, a lot of gardens have green space in the city, which makes also a lot of sense. So gardens in terms of private gardens and parks. And the third thing was that the kitchens should not be in the basements, as everywhere in London. I mean, they are still there, but should be on the first floor. That was all. I mean, the rest is a description of what I consider a very intelligent, very practical, and also if I may say, a rather traditional ideal city.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what was the name again of the city? Can you repeat it?
Hygeia. It's
Hygeia.
yes. It's HYGIEA.
Okay. And it is located where, or was it actually realized as a plan, or was it just a
no. It's just an ideal city. It's just
okay.
it has never. There is not even a plan of the city. There is just a text describing it.
Okay.
Because Richardson was a doctor, so he could not draw plans, and he just described it in a text.
And this was about
it was a
when?
lecture originally.
Yeah, and it was about
it
when?
It was 1800 and I think 40 something. So in the middle of the 19th century.
In the middle of the 19th century, yeah. So that's actually predating.
It was immediately after,
the
let's say, it was also a reaction to, I can look it up more, 1875. So it was after, let's say, the third big cholera epidemics that struck London.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So basically you're saying all it needs for the city to actually accommodate these problems well is a rather simple set of prescriptive kind of assignments, how to manage urban space, or basically the dwelling space also. And it doesn't need to kind of rewire the city as a typology, right? So it's basically, you don't need to design a city in that sense for the city to be able to cope with health crises such as that. Is that true? I hope you can understand me. Can you hear me, Vittorio?
I'm sort of losing you. I think we have a right now. I'm sorry. The internet connection is it's pretty bad here.
I see. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear
me now?
Perfect. Yes, that's perfect. You're back.
Okay, good. Well, I was just saying. Then obviously, you think you don't need to redesign the city to be able to cope with healthcare crises such as the plagues and so on, but you need only a set of rather simple measures that one can easily adhere to, right? We don't need to invent a new form of city.
Absolutely. I don't think we need to invent a new form of the city, but I'm not saying that this catastrophe that we are envisaging is something that we should take lightly or ignore as urban designer. And I think it is a big chance in some way to rethink a lot of single aspects of the city that don't work anyway, and now that very clearly are something that is not leading us anywhere.
Which are these problems?
I give you an example. Oops, now I lost you again.
Yes, please continue. I can hear you.
Okay, so fine. I hope it works. So I just give you an example. For instance, the question of density. I clearly, I've always thought that a dense city is the only way we can deal with the modern city. I think that it needs to be dense for many reasons, for economical reasons, for social reasons. I don't want to go. Well, we can also go into that, but we don't need to. But if you and now a lot of people come and say, we cannot afford this dense city anymore because it's so unhealthy. We have to go back. Actually, we cannot afford the city anymore. We have to go back to the countryside. A stupid, frankly, a reaction. Also a reaction that has nothing to do with the reality. I'm here near Milan. The epidemic broke off in Codogno, which is a a village where basically everybody died. The main center of the epidemics was then Bergamo, which is a very small and very pretty city actually. And even if you look at the let's say at the spots, if you look more in detail at let's say at the plan of Milan and see where the epidemics was stronger, it was not in the center. It was in the periphery. And it's also clear why, because in the center live the wealthy people, and in the periphery live the poor people. And the poor people live in cramped houses, in bad houses, in unhealthy houses. And this has nothing to do with, you know, with the build density of the city. It has to do with Überbelegung, now with how many people live in a place. It's the old problem of the 19th century. The city of the 19th century was not dense. It was used in a very dense way because apartments that were meant for a family were used by 5 families. But this is not an architectural problem. This is a social problem. It's an economical problem, and it's a political problem. And so what I really hope is that instead of you know, digging out the old hate for the city because it's so dangerous and menacing, we use this crisis to acknowledge and change the real social problems that we have in the city. If you look at the plan of Manhattan, actually, it's exactly the same. I mean, the epidemics, it's not in the Upper East Side, you know. It's not a problem there. It's in the Bronx. Or it's in downtown. So,
could it also be that the people on the Upper East Side went to the Hamptons, to the holiday house?
For instance, in Milan, it's probably not the case because we were not allowed to. And I'm now in our holiday house, but for the first time, and there was a lot of police controlling, so it was not possible. Not possible. No, yeah. But you know, there are now very interesting experiments that we should. For instance, there is I forget the name, but there is one city in Italy that is trying to deal with this problem of coronavirus by and of course one of the problems is public transport. So they say don't use public transport, use bikes and walk. It's a small city, so it works, and they have obliged the cars not to drive 50 in the city, not to drive 30 kilometers in the city, but to drive 10 kilometers. I mean, like, you know, almost like a pedestrian. And it seems to work. It seems to work. So you know, in Italy, you know, we love cars, and we're supposed at least to love driving. So I really think that this is a very big chance to rethink a lot of things about the city, but not its, let's say, its main mission and its main form.
I mean, you were saying that this crisis is an opportunity for us to deal with issues that the city had in the past, already before this crisis. What kind of issues would these be?
But the first issue, of course, is a social issue. The problem of a lot of people not being in the position to pay their houses, basically, no? or to pay just very ugly houses, very unhealthy houses, very small houses, or to have to share them with too many other people. Then there is, of course, the issues of the parks, which is a serious issue, and I think they need to be improved, and they are and they are showing to be a big asset. And then there is a big issue of public transport, let's say of transport in the city, of mobility in the city at all, and there I think that. Or at least I have started. I mean, I've always been an advocate of public transport. I've always thought this is the solution. We don't want individual transport, because I've always identified individual transport with a car. But if if you give up the idea of the car, and if you think of other means like bicycles, trottinette, and whatever you want, and if you think of creating in the whole city a situation where you can really drive, let's say individually, but with your own forces, easily and without danger, and also with a certain pleasure. This could really change the way we live in the city. But again, I think that the the basic condition is a compact city, because this is, of course, absolutely impossible in suburbia, and it's absolutely impossible in the diffuse city. It's also absolutely impossible if you live some way in the outskirts of the city and have to go into the center to work. That's not an option.
Mm-hmm. Some people also said that actually the crisis and the lockdown showed how important it is actually to have more uncommercialized public space, because the minute that restaurants and shops and cafes were closed, people all flocked to like the kind of old-fashioned public spaces, a square with a bench, some trees, or a park. It was obvious that these spaces were not enough to actually accommodate all the people that actually wanted to use them. Do you think we need to implement more green spaces in the city than we have currently?
Depends on what city you're talking about. Now,
okay,
let's
talk about Paris. Let's talk about Paris.
Yes, I think, well, Paris has done now a lot with the new parks, Citroën and so on. So they are improving, let's say, this very compact, dense density. But yes, I think that every city extension should consider a big park in its interior in some way, as a public space. But I don't think, frankly, that public spaces need to be parks. I mean, they are not only parks; they are also squares. They are also. I don't think that the trees are the solution to every evil of the city. And I think that a beautiful square where you have benches, where you have arcades, where you can, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's an important point, where you can sit down without having to drink something and pay for it. That's a very important asset. But again, do you see, this is something, it's not a problem of the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis makes these problems much more crucial, much more visible.
It's just amplified.
Yes, but it is amplified, but it's an old problem.
Okay. I'd like to invite our audience to ask questions whenever you want to. You know, this is an opportunity for you to pose a question to Professor Lampugnani. So you can do this in the commentary field or in this little icon that you see with a question mark, and you can write a question in there. And actually, my colleague Andreas Kofler, who helps me, like my other colleague Yuma, will send them to me, and I can, so that I don't overlook them as I'm speaking with Vittorio. Just coming back to the history of urban design, in the early 20th century, of course, we know that the city planning had been reinvented by architects and urbanists through this kind of claim, light, air, and sun. And the entire typological canon of what is a city was redefined then. We see that the perimeter block was basically left as a too closed form in favor of Zeilenbau, as we say in German, with large green spaces in between these buildings, with the resultant of density going down, and the ratio between solid and void going actually towards the void. How do you view this kind of change in the city? retrospectively, also with this kind of experience of Corona today, was it a brave attempt of the discipline to deal with healthcare problems at the end of the 19th century, or was it, let's say, maybe too immediate reaction?
If I may, I answer a little bit provocatively to your question. I think it was a great solution if we think that that living in the city means living basically in our apartment with a lot of sun and air, very healthy, and a nice view on a park around, and all the rest is done with a car. Then it's perfect, because the I mean, we have witnessed it everywhere, because this idea of the city with a low density, with let's say the primate of the housing, so good orientation, light, and so on, against urban space and also against public space, actually, means that you have a very diffuse city. You have very long distances, and you're totally dependent, not on public transport, because there is not even enough density for public transport. You're totally dependent on your private car. Of course, that was the time when everybody believed in that. The private car was the let's say the instrument of freedom, of individual freedom, and maybe it was difficult also to understand at that time what kind of consequences this would have. But we have seen now the consequences. So I really think that that we need to go back to what the city really needs to do, but especially you know, how we want to live. I mean, do we really want to live? Of course, it's very healthy and it's very safe to live in a private garden, totally isolated. You don't see anybody, you don't embrace anybody, you don't kiss anybody. But do you really want to live like that? I don't, frankly. So I prefer, first of all, to take some risks, and get near to people, even if now I agree it's very dangerous. It's objectively dangerous, but I think we need, you know, not to change the city, but to change our attitude towards environment, our attitude towards nature, because it's very clear. I think it's now scientifically demonstrated that this pandemic crisis that are, you know, coming every now almost every 5 to 10 years, they have to do with our climate changes. They have to do with the killing of biodiversity. It's very clear where they come from, and I think this is a good moment really to change this, because let's say the pressure, also the political pressure, is very strong.
There's an interesting question from the audience. We have two now. The first is asking, do we need a new scale for the city in terms of the urban typologies? Something between the neighborhood and the block, perhaps something near the superblock of Cerdà, in order to keep density, but to also afford spatially public space differently. Can you make sense of that?
It's a very good question. I don't know the answer. I think, frankly, that that different models are possible. So basically, all these models are about neighborhood, and all these models are about community. The question is how big or how small this community is, or can be, or must be, and how it can, let's say, interact with other communities. Personally, I think that let's say the neighborhood ideas of the 20s and the 30s were, sociologically speaking, quite intelligent, not saying the neighborhood is around a school, is around, of course, kindergarten, and that's, let's say, the core. It's very small. It's very everybody can knows each other, and then they interact on different scales, of course, with other neighbors. But I think that this idea that what we really have to do in urban design is to enhance and I mean, we cannot create it. We are not we are not politicians, we're not sociologists, but we need to create the spaces that allow and encourage this kind of community.
Mm-hmm. But
and
when,
that's my main criticism, since you, Andreas, was saying we're talking about the urban design of the 20s, and the Siedlungen and the Ville Contemporaine. That's my main criticism, that the idea of community got lost in this type of, not so much the idea of community, but the possibility of community got lost.
Of encountering each other, actually, because there was not enough
because there was no place, no place where to do it.
Yes, also that. Yes. Do you think that actually? I mean, usually everybody would agree that to have public space is great, but we also know that the buildable territory in the city is very sparse, and usually public space is something difficult to afford because you cannot monetize it. So if you provide it, if you produce it, you have to have a strong city, a strong political will of the government to do it.
Sure.
The question is, where do we get this more public space if we want to have it? Do you think that the rooftop, for instance, is an underestimated second horizon of the city that could be exploited much more systematically?
Yes and no. I don't think that the rooftops can substitute the square, let's say the village square in the city, then where you can sit and have a drink or don't have a drink. I think that's absolutely necessary. But I think that, for instance, let's say in the small communities, what was asked before, now the community of the block, that there is some kind. The rooftops could be some kind of intermediate, let's say, public spaces for the people living in, if it's a large block, in the block. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So yes, I think they are, and I think they have a big potential to be designed in different ways.
Yeah. We have a question from a young Zurich-based office or architect, Felix Yapazidi, and he's asking, what do you reckon the consequences of a raised acceptance of home office? What could that do to the need of office space after all? Might there be a big potential for changing office space to housing in the long run?
Well, I think we all have done home working lately, more or less. So I think we all know the advantages and also the disadvantages of that. I mean, I'm not a workspace specialist, but I think, let's say, the experience that we did or we are doing with our office, for instance, is. I mean, we're doing fine. No, we have continued to work. I think that home working is an absolute possibility for certain activities. I think that a lot of meetings that we were supposed to we're supposed to do absolutely by traveling a lot and meeting in person can be done by Zoom or whatever program you have. But I do not believe that let's say the more creative moments, the more how should I say, this more casual moments can be substituted by home working, as long as you work very, very systematically on a very clear task that you can do interacting easily by phone, video, and at home. But I think that if we would all do well, first of all, I think that, for instance, the creative aspect of a design um, or the creative aspect of every work, I don't believe that this is done by one single person sitting alone in a cell. Of course, it's also, you also need concentration and quiet, but then at least I need, I need dialogue and criticism and new ideas from other people that I don't have, and back and forth. And this can be done, I think, only in person. So,
Is that really
sorry
so?
for. Hmm?
Because, I'm wondering, my son, for instance, he's 12 years old and he loves to play computer games like many of his peers. And interestingly enough, he didn't find the Corona crisis a very kind of estranging situation, because he was basically playing with his friends on a server in the internet, and he was completely seamlessly communicating with them. They speak at the same time as they play with each other in a virtual space in which they all interact together. And for him, it makes actually almost no difference if his friend who lives on the next block really comes to his room and they play side by side. The most important thing is that on the screen, they interact in the same digital kind of space. Or if his friend actually is at home because he's not allowed to go because it's lockdown, for him, it made no difference. So I'm wondering, is it a generational thing that maybe digital migrants like you and me have a hard time understanding to work creatively together with other people in digital space, whereas digital, what's the term for it? People that grew up with the digital means and didn't have to adapt to it, natives, digital natives, that's the term. Maybe they find it completely normal. Could you think that's possible? That maybe a generation or two generations later, this will become quite acceptable?
Everything is possible, and of course, for me, it's very difficult to imagine what it is for another generation, because I'm trying to learn, to work with these devices. For instance, I'm enjoying our conversation very much right now. I think it works very, 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 very well. I also think we lose a lot, frankly. I think that if I would see you better, it also has to do with my eyes, but if I would see you better, if I would see your movements a little bit better, the very small expressions when you get bored by what I'm saying, for instance, and don't want to show it, I think we could have still a more intense exchange. But I don't know. I mean, the question, what will it do to office space? Frankly, I think that we will need more of, let's say, a different type of office space. So less and less, the place where you have your cubicle and to do your work and then go home. More of communicative space, more of informal spaces in terms of the office. But I think we need it, at least in our office, even if we have well, not quite as young people as your son, probably, but we have young people, much younger than I, definitely, in our office, and they too say they miss it. I mean, they too start now coming back to the office. We keep the distances and so on, but they miss this being together, have informal exchange, and have this very casual exchange. When somebody's talking about something that has nothing to do with work, but then all of a sudden it is an inspiration. And I think this is what we are missing. Incidentally, coronavirus is doing something interesting also, because we have a building here in Milan by Oscar Niemeyer. It's in Segrate. You may know it. It's a very big office building from Mondadori. It's a publishing house. And this is it was done in the 60s. So it's totally air-conditioned building. quite
of course.
quite.
Yeah.
So again, since I don't like air conditioning anyway, I think that that there is again here this hygienic crisis has a chance to, or we should take it as a chance to reconsider this kind of things. For instance, do we really want to work in a conditioned building that is perfect, where we have always the real temperature, where we don't need to put on the sweater in the winter, or could it be something else?
Mm-hmm. I would like, let's drill a bit deeper with this question of office space and housing space. I read today that the biggest French car manufacturer, PSA, who is responsible for the brands Peugeot, Citroën, and Opel, just pronounced that he wants his employees who are not working in the factory to only work 1 or 2 days per week in the office and do homework for the rest of the week. So I mean, it's a fairly important decision, because it's a large company. It affects many people who will do that, and it's very likely that they will reduce, if they really go through this, their actual office space. Now, kind of project this scenario to a space that you produced as an urban designer, the Novartis campus, purely fictional, of course. Imagine, let's say, 60% of the office spaces there would become empty, would no longer be usable. Of course, the company would think about converting this space and to make use in a different way. What do you think is possible in this project? Because I always had the feeling what you actually did with this Novartis campus was a city in the moment of awaiting itself. Of course, it was functionally described and defined as a research campus for Novartis, but in terms of its design, the streets, the dimensions, the typologies of the open space, it is a piece of city. It's like a city extension. Did you actually design it with this idea that this entire work environment could eventually, if conditions change, become a mixed, functionally mixed neighborhood of the city in which you can both work and live and spend your leisure time in the park, for instance? And do you think that kind of model could be applicable to many environments in the city that today are primarily or totally office space?
If they are well designed, yes, of course. I mean, the campus, the Novartis campus, I mean, you're perfectly right, and I never hid it from anybody. It was designed as a small city for the simple reason that the main task for us was to create a kind of environment for creative work, for knowledge management, for exchange of information, and the model of the city is just the best model for that. It was created for as a machine to exchange knowledge, basically. At least that's my definition of very simplified, I admit, definition of the city. So yes, Andreas, of course, it can. I mean, it has already changed a lot. It changed even while we were building it, because we started with some needs, some users' needs, and when the buildings were finished, so basically 2 years after the design, they needed to be used by somebody else, and with a different scope. So that's why we try to do a very robust structure, and this is a structure that works as a, let's say, as a forbidden city, which is now with security, with also problems of danger because they have production, but it could as well open up, and it would work as a piece of totally normal city, and you still would have security in some of the buildings because you have security inside with badges. So I think that's what we are asked to do. You know, we have to design cities without knowing exactly what they are for. I mean, in functional terms, yes. Because because we are thinking, or we should think in long term, and it's just impossible to know what will happen in 20 years. That's why I'm very wary of this idea of now creating or let's say of modifying our cities according to pandemic problems, because I hope we won't have them, at least not in such a drastic way in the future. But again, because I hope we will be intelligent enough to change basically our life, which is not so easy to do.
Okay. Our discussion is slowly coming to an end. We have a couple of more minutes before we have to stop. I wanted to know one final thing. This year basically has seen the cancellation of many important architectural events. The Salon del Mobile in Milan, but also the Architectural Biennial in Venice, of course, had to be cancelled or postponed to next year. Do you regret these kind of tendencies, or do you think actually some sort of event detox helps us also to come to our senses as to what we could do with the situation?
Absolutely. I absolutely think it's very healthy. Like it's healthy for me personally to have to cancel, or they have just been canceled, a lot of meetings and lectures and things where I find out I can do it very easily with Zoom, or I can do also very easily without them because they are not so necessary. And the same goes, I think, for the big, let's say, these big events. I mean, you're in this business too, Andreas. We could spend our lives if we wanted to going from one event to the other and do just nothing at all productively speaking, because it would just be from one cocktail party to the other.
Yes.
And I don't think that's a very intelligent way to spend one's life.
Yes. And also for the environment is not necessarily the best scenario, obviously.
That's another and very important matter. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people like this this position that you just read. I can see it from the comments. Well, thanks a lot, Vittorio. We could obviously spend much more time discussing this, but maybe we do this hopefully again live at some time soon, live then in 4 dimensions, so we can actually see each other and have a drink. It would be cool. I want to thank also our audience for staying with us. Thank you for bearing with us with the technical problems. I still have to adjust a little bit to the intricacies of these of this situation. I would love to announce to you that in a week, today in a week, I will be talking with Ludovica Molo, who is an architect from Lugano in Switzerland, who is also the president of the Association of Architects in Switzerland, the BSA. It's a very important figure. She is teaching in Lucerne, and she is living in the Ticino, which is obviously the most hit region of COVID-19 in Switzerland, and actually one of the most affected regions in the world if you consider the amount of cases with regard to the footprint of the area. So I'm sure she has many interesting experiences to relate to us, and I'm looking forward to continue this discussion. We're already preparing new talks after her. And thanks for tuning in again next Friday at 5 p.m. And yeah, thanks, Vittorio, and talk to you sometime soon.
Thank you, Andreas, and thanks to everybody who has listened. I'm very proud I made it with Instagram, and it was really very pleasurable. Thanks a lot.
Super.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.